Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching. It is the American Dufus Show. Don't be a doofus. Please subscribe, like, and you're going to want to share this one. It's going to be a good one. And comment if you would. We have Ford Fischer with us for this episode. We've seen Ford behind the camera numerous times on this show. Boots on the ground, modern day war correspondent, one of the best in the country, the most versatile in the country, without a doubt, one of the top five in anybody's list. And welcome to the show, Ford Fischer.
Thank you. Yeah, I will say that I try not to compare myself to war correspondents because I do know several of them. And I do think that the type of conflict that I cover, which is generally domestic, activism-driven conflict, is not super comparable to situations like, international, are like perpetually armed conflict. So
Right.
I do lay out that distinction when sometimes people have introduced me as he's like a war correspondent. Like,
Yeah.
I think what I do is important, but I think it's different than what a war correspondent does. And occasionally it overlaps enough that I do meet them and learn a lot about their experiences as well.
But at the same time, a lot of people in the country think we're in a Cold War right now.
Yeah.
So
I have heard people point that out. A Cold War, like a second Cold War.
yeah.
Or a Cold Civil War.
As you've said, you've been in a lot of different situations, covering a lot of different things. We're going to talk about a few of those, but
sure.
To begin with, how did you get started doing this?
Yeah, so I co-founded NEWS2SHARE while I was in college, and among the first sort of stories that we covered that kind of guided us on the path of doing raw footage of journalism were the uprisings in Ferguson and Baltimore in 2015 and 2014 and 2015. And so upon graduation from college here in Washington, D.C., I was able to sort of continue this business full time. And so at this point, I've expanded it to the point where I occasionally am able to hire freelancers to cover other things, but I spend most of my time sort of traveling the country and doing raw footage and live stream documenting of generally activist situations that go on. And I try to the best of my ability to essentially just show those things as they happen, sort of a C-SPAN of political activism, rather than taking any particular sides while I'm out there. So sometimes people will accuse me of being on one side or the other because I basically just show exactly kind of what's going on. And so, things can be seen that are good, bad, and ugly. And I try to just sort of show it how it is.
And it's important that it's shown good, bad, and ugly, because different news medias in the mainstream media take those little segments and they give the people 90 seconds of what they want framed and how they want it presented. Whereas what you do and those of us that appreciate what you do and share what you do is so valuable because you tell the entire story.
Right. And so I like to think of it as kind of the building blocks for news and documentary. So by having the complete story, people can look at my work and they can see the full context and all of that, which is wonderful. But then they also, as news outlets, as documentaries then want to cover these subjects after they happen, they're able to license from me. And so films that might use a small piece of my footage or something, as opposed to basically any other source like the AP Wire or Reuters or something, in my case, when something of mine is used in a documentary film, people could refer back to the original and see the complete context of the scene that's used in the documentary. So in that sense, I think that in addition to sort of competing with the mainstream media and providing an alternative to them, I do think in a way I make the mainstream media more accountable to themselves as well.
I totally agree. I couldn't agree more. So let's talk about an average day when
Sure.
you're in the field. Okay, because people don't understand how much goes in. They just take for granted. Ford's out there with his camera, awesome. They don't realize how much preparation goes in. How much preparation goes into putting a show on like I do is a bunch. But what you do, tell us what a day's like in the field.
Yeah, so I mean, I do cover a lot that's out of state for me. So I live here in Washington, D.C., and so it's a little bit easier to cover events that take place here, right? I can wake up in the morning and see that something's going to go on and then just get there. But when I travel to a story, I really do try to do a lot more understanding of like the context of what I'm getting into, right? So if police are facing off with protesters, such as in the last week I was in Elizabeth City, right? They're doing so because of the shooting of Andrew Brown. So not only do I have to understand the tactics of like the actual, police enforcement versus protesters and so forth, reading up on like executive orders and like whatever is being used to enforce a curfew and so forth, but also understanding the actual background of that situation, right? There's a reason that people are out there fighting for whatever they believe in. And so going into these situations, understanding that, I think is important. So, especially when there's travel, there can be an enormous amount of prep involved before the moment that the live stream actually begins. When I actually film, the way that I do it is I have a HD sort of cinema quality camera, and then I mount a phone on top of that. So the live stream you see is an angle almost exactly identical to what I'm filming out of the HD camera, but the HD camera is getting the much better quality. So then after the fact, I usually cut down videos kind of as quickly as I can into sort of a 10-minute highlight reel of the same stuff that you would have seen on the live stream. And so the result of that, or the idea behind that, is that I can show people the highlights of what happened to be clear, in a very raw format. You very seldom actually see me in those videos. But that if somebody watched that cut down and then wanted to see broader context for someone's statements in it, or an entire speech as opposed to a clip of a speech or whatever, they could go back and reference the live stream and see the entire thing beginning to end.
And that's what we do here most of the time. I started restreaming just major events. And you're at a lot of them. But then it became a situation where I'm not going to be tonight on Wednesday, but because of our episode here. But normally I'm live streaming just about every night now because of the situation we find ourselves in. Dante Wright, then the George Floyd verdict, then Elizabeth City, as you spoke of. Now Mesquite, Texas could be the next situation. It just seems like it's going to be a long, hot summer for a lot of us.
Yeah, it might be. And I mean, I think that there's a greater kind of like awareness building where it's not that these situations, police shootings, police brutality are, I think, changing fundamentally. It's that people's awareness of them are going up, both because of the technology involved, the rapidness with which people can talk about these things on social media. So the protests in Elizabeth City formed very quickly. For example, and same with Dante Wright and so forth. Whereas in the early years, I guess like 5 or 6 years ago of Black Lives Matter, they were very, very focused on the particular cities they happened. Now the entire country is hearing about these situations very rapidly, right? The night of the Dante Wright shooting, I was in Washington, D.C. because it's where I live, and I was able to cover a protest in D.C. that formed with hundreds of people protesting over the shooting of Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, that formed hours later.
Right.
So people are quick to respond. Word spreads in a way that it kind of never has before.
And that's what we normally do on this show. Normally the segments are all recorded. I'll take like 90 seconds of what you have done, and then I'll say, for the rest of it, go see Ford Fischer at NEWS2SHARE on Facebook or on YouTube. And a lot like what you said the mainstream media does. We're able to get it out a lot quicker than mainstream media does.
Right.
And sometimes, like the Mesquite, Texas story, we may be 2 days ahead of mainstream media. So the independent media helps to get that message out quicker. And the protests you were talking about that started so fast start because of social media.
Yeah, I think that's true. And what's kind of interesting in the last year is that Facebook used to be largely the place that activists on all sides of the political spectrum organized. And in the last year, the right wing has become largely deplatformed, especially those that would be organizing events on Facebook. So I see barely any conservative events organized on Facebook anymore anyway, because they are eliminated almost immediately if they do exist. And the left, the political left here, has largely, for two reasons, kind of stopped it as far as I've seen. Firstly, Facebook has made it harder, right? So Facebook censorship is affecting the left, even if slightly less as it relates to Facebook events. Um, but also there is sort of an increasing OPSEC concern. So like after
Right.
social media especially was used in the prosecution of, now I think we're coming up on 500 people who participated in a riot on the Capitol on January 6th. I think the extent to which the federal government in particular monitors Facebook has certainly discouraged more radical elements of the left from organizing there. So it is still pretty normal for me to see maybe like an environmental protest, center left type events, sort of Democratic Party aligned events. But protests pertaining to, police violence, protests that would be of sort of an anarchist mindset. And to be clear, the two last things I said are not necessarily one and the same.
Right.
But those sorts of events, I think, are largely siphoning off of Facebook. Like they're trying to depend on it less and less.
Right. I agree. So we're limited on time. Let's talk about a couple of events.
Sure.
But before, since you've actually been there, and some people don't have a concept of what we're talking about. Real quick, less lethal weapons.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk about that?
Right. So in general riot situations, and I should be clear that like sometimes I've seen them threaten to be used when the situation is clearly not a riot. But in the context of policing crowds, a common tactic or a common sort of subset of weaponry is what they refer to as less lethal weapons. So these are often like green or orange shotguns that shoot rubber bullets, bean bags. They have separate, sort of rubber bullet firing weapons, tear gas, in some cases like smoke, like that basically just like obscures vision and you cough like a little bit, but it doesn't have the chemicals that make tear gas. Many of these weapons, right, are defined as less lethal in the sense that, like that's how they're marked, less lethal, but to be clear, not less than lethal, right? So somebody can potentially, be killed, right? If somebody took a rubber bullet, to the temple, it is possible that somebody could die. There have been recorded instances of people dying as a result of tear gas. People have respiratory, failures, injuries, and so forth because of that. People have certainly lost eyes with rubber bullets. So weapons classified as less lethals are generally used in these sorts of protests, basically to deter crowds, with the ability to essentially shoot them, with the at least ostensible purpose being to do so without, killing people. I will say that part of the problem that I have seen in policing using those things too aggressively is that they start to do so a little bit more indiscriminately. So on May 29th and on May 30th and 31st, the second and third day of intense George Floyd protests in DC that escalated to what would sort of traditionally be referred to as a riot.
Right.
On May 30th, I was hit twice with sting ball rounds, which are basically like, they're sort of like a paintball, except that they have material in them like pepper spray. So they can shoot something at a long and relatively precise distance that then explodes with a sort of pepper spray like effect. And so on May 30th, I was hit with one of those in the gut, which didn't do too much damage. It just kind of left a welt. But I was hit with one in the shoulder, like right here. And that actually left me functionally blinded for about 10 minutes. And on May 31st, as leftists were basically firing fireworks at the police. So to be clear, this was a two-sided engagement.
Right.
But police fired a rubber bullet that hit me in the forehead and left me with about a half golf ball size sore that was sticking out of my head for, probably healed in about a week for the most part. But, a dead-on headshot. But in both cases, I was very obviously visibly pressed, right? So I had a large camera on a tripod with a phone on top of it, and I was wearing my congressional press pass on my body. So, I mean, I don't think anybody could have possibly believed I was anything other than press. And yet I was hit with 3 less lethals over the course of 2 days. So I guess my point is that in my experience, the use of less lethal weaponry probably incentivizes police to more liberally apply them, and that can lead to some indiscriminate usage. Whereas I think if police were limited to harsher weapons, not that that would be preferable, but my guess is that they'd be a little bit more conservative about let's think about firing at journalists.
We would hope, but my friend, you're a war correspondent, okay? But you want to accept what we just heard. You are a war correspondent, and again, we're limited on time. I want to get to the Capitol,
sure,
January 6th, but before that, one of the most harrowing things I've seen was you covering an event in Georgia where the NFAC was supposed to be there. They didn't show up. A bunch of counter protesters had showed up. Then other counter protesters to that counter protest showed up from Atlanta, I believe, and things got really crazy.
Yeah.
You remember the event I'm talking about?
Yeah, so this was an August event that pertained to the Confederate Memorial at Stone Mountain Park. And so there have generally been efforts to basically sandblast Stone Mountain, is like the usual call from the left there. The idea is that it's basically the Mount Rushmore of the Confederacy. And so the political people on the right, kind of a coalition that included right-wing militia groups, neo-Confederate groups, Trump supporters, kind of showed up heavily armed, sort of in defense of the monument, whereas there were left-wing counter-protesters, largely led by an organization that called themselves Flower, Frontline I'm trying to remember the Working to End Racism, Frontline Organization Working to End Racism, I think, off the top of my head. And so the Flower Coalition is a leftist coalition that includes everything from a DSA chapter, Democratic Socialists, to some Black Lives Matter chapters, to the Atlanta Antifa, and they were also armed. And so this created a fairly provocative situation where you had two heavily armed sides, and there were several individual skirmishes that would almost universally go the same way. People would be carrying Confederate flags. Someone from the left would come and basically swipe the Confederate flag out of somebody's hands in order to basically pull it away and set it on fire, was kind of their goal. Where, they weren't necessarily instigating violence per se, like they weren't coming up to fight them, but they were coming up to take their property out of their hands to destroy it. And of course, the right would react by, punching, hitting, pushing around, and whatever. And so these fights got escalated, but they were further escalated by the fact that ultimately there's firearms on either side of it. So ultimately there were no shots fired. But I remember that the moment or the situation that really, really most scared me, where I was like practically cringing, waiting for the shot, was someone swiped a flag. Sure. Somebody goes to attack the person who swiped the flag. Someone goes to attack that person back. It escalated into people kind of hitting each other on the ground. One person used mace, and then another person actually whacked that guy with a baseball bat.
Yeah.
And I really remember thinking, like, in that moment that I watched someone be hit in the head with a baseball bat, and there are guns around. I remember thinking, like, someone's going to decide to shoot somebody right now. And thankfully that did not happen. But that was an extremely provocative, sort of dangerous situation. And ultimately, the police let this go on for basically about 4 hours. I mean, it was an incredibly long situation where, you had militia members with rifles, shotguns, and everything. And there were even moments that I saw, like, an individual on the left who was sort of in a face down with them, pull a handgun out and hold it at lower ready. So, like, things really had escalated. And ultimately, the police cleared the entire situation by setting up a riot line, riot shields, move back, move back, move back. And they sort of pushed everybody, but they pushed them all in the same direction.
I know.
There was a moment that was, like, really shocking to me, just in terms of, like, how sort of nonchalant the police were about this, which was that the leader of the 3% security force, which is a right-wing militia named, his name is Chris Hill, found himself face to face with a guy fully in black clothing, head to toe dressed in black. And Black Bloc guy had a shotgun in his hand, without a stock, so a relatively lightweight shotgun. And shotgun guy is flicking the safety on and off on his gun, which has been racked. So he's flicking it on and off from safe to essentially ready to fire. And meanwhile, Chris Hill is sort of facing him down and keeping his hand on a pistol at his side. And so these two are essentially daring each other to draw first, right? This is a good, the bad, and the ugly, to reference that again.
Yeah.
But this is a sort of a standoff moment. And as the police are pushing them, this weird standoff actually continues to occur with the police watching it. And the police aren't saying, hey, you two, separate. Right, stop that. Right, none of that happened. These two guys are facing each other down over, like, essentially who wants to draw first. And the police pretty much just push them in the same direction, like, all right, we're moving. And the only reference I heard from a cop to either of them, like, making it safe is one of the police officers tells shotgun guy, hey, could you just make sure that your finger is, you're supposed to people who don't know, you're supposed to keep your finger straight, like near the trigger, but straight forward, so that you know that you're not going to accidentally grip it, right? As opposed to, like, you wouldn't hold the handgun like this, you should hold it like this. So apparently he wasn't doing that. I didn't actually see him violate that rule, but, like, a police officer basically said something like, hey, could you just have your finger sticking out? And he said something like, I actually teach a firearms class, so if you'd want to attend my class sometime, I could help you carry that safer. Like, this was an armed confrontation between two people, and the cops just, like, giving him kind of, like, trigger discipline advice and saying, maybe you want to take my class. Like, the nonchalantness with which they were dealing with an armed face-off was just sort of astounding to me. I had never seen anything like it before.
It was surreal. And I watched every single moment of that with you. It wasn't live. I wasn't restreaming it. I was just watching it, mesmerized and so concerned for what was going to happen to you. Because so many times you described it eloquently, but so many times you were in the middle of those two things just because of where you happened to be positioned. Things just came where you were.
I try to keep a mental awareness sort of the crossfire. Like, if these two people just start shooting at each other, essentially, am I in the course of either of their fire? And so there were a few times where I ended up behind one of them, almost over their shoulder, which I did not like, because if they got blasted away, then I'd be behind them. But again, thankfully, no shots were fired, and for the most part, I was able to sort of, I think, avoid being flagged. But I mean, if you watch my live streams enough, one thing that I'll note is I do get, I point it out to people when they flag me. To people who don't know, flagging means, like, someone who casually, nonchalantly, or accidentally sort of points a firearm at somebody. I've covered enough armed situations to sort of, like, be very, very aware of people's muzzles, and I do point it out to people when they're pointing a gun at me, or more often, actually. For the love of God, people, if you're a gun owner, do not rest the tip of your gun on your shoe. Like, for some reason, I see this happen, like, at various events, like, where people will, like, use a rifle to, like, lean on, and they'll literally, like, point the gun into their, like, foot. And it's like, yes, I know your finger's not on the trigger. Yes, I know you probably, like, have the safety on or whatever, like, and you probably know whether you've, like, chambered around or not, but, like, treat every gun like it's loaded and about to fire.
Oh.
Like, don't intentionally point the gun, like, into your, yeah.
All right, Louisville, because that happened in Louisville. That what you're talking about happened in Louisville.
Yes. So in Louisville, I believe I was actually the only camera who captured it. Unfortunately, only on my live stream. I started recording on my HD camera, like, immediately when it happened. But on my live stream, I did capture as the NFAC, again, a black nationalist militia, was gathered in Louisville. And this was, I think it was their first event of that size. They had a march for Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. They're based in Georgia. They had a march for Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and they had one march earlier at Stone Mountain Park. But this was their first trip to Louisville, which ended up being a really big sort of hot spot for them. And as they were gathering, and ironically, as they were doing a safety check, one person accidentally discharged a shotgun. And 3 people went down, right? So this is why muzzle discipline matters. One person discharged a shotgun, and 3 people went down. My understanding is basically they were holding it low, but like at their side. So that's how you would have a horizontal spray of, I'm not sure if it was like birdshot or buckshot, but it definitely had enough of a spread to hit a few people. But one of them seriously injured, but three total injuries. What was sort of thankful was that there actually was, it was an extremely hot day. People were suffering from like heat injuries. One person had already was being treated by EMS on scene, so there was already an ambulance there. So EMS was able to respond very quickly. And my understanding is that the individual who accidentally fired the shotgun was actually not charged with a crime. There was a second in Lafayette, Louisiana. I was on scene as there was a second accidental discharge at an NFAC event. However, that time it was not an NFAC member. It was they were marching to a park that was a few blocks away, and an individual who had sort of self-styled as like a Black Panther or something, like aligned with the NFAC but not one of them, actually managed to accidentally discharge their firearm twice, 2 shots in rapid succession, and they were arrested at gunpoint and actually charged with felon in possession of a firearm. So the NFAC was very quick to emphasize that, they don't allow, they do background checks. So a felon would not have been able to be part of the NFAC. So two situations with accidental shots fired in the past year. And then, of course, I know you wanted to talk about January 6th, which was the most recent situation I've been at with shot fired.
Yeah, I've been saving that to last. What, just between us, what's your opinion of NFAC?
Well, I try not to give opinions on much of anything. I do try to just give, sort of objective explanations of like what they're about and whatever. So, I will say that I think that the NFAC probably has a challenging time ahead of them if they do intend to continue organizing. And the reason I say that is that on September 5th, they had the NFAC return to Louisville. And I filmed again as there was a big armed demonstration. And but the night before, the leader of the NFAC, who calls himself Grandmaster Jay, had allegedly pointed his rifle up at 2 cops who had been deputized as federal agents. And so he is charged and faces a 20-year felony for basically assault with deadly weapon. Of course, he did not fire his gun, but he looked up through a scope, allegedly, at federal agents. Or people deputized as federal agents. And so, with the leader of a militia not being able to carry firearms well on bond for a very serious felony, I think that it is. I would be pretty surprised if I saw a large scale NFAC formation come up in the upcoming months. There has not been one since that arrest occurred.
Okay, we got just a few more minutes to go because I know you've got a hard close. You've got.
It can be a soft close if we need a little bit more time to answer the question.
All right. The last thing we want to bring up is and by the way, we talk a lot about Grandmaster Jay and NFAC on this show. So yeah. Last thing we want to bring up is January 6th.
Right.
In your hometown, the Capitol building was stormed.
Yeah.
Did you ever think you'd see something like that to begin with?
No, I mean, I think that the thing that made it possible was that the police seemed drastically underprepared for it. Like, I think that a plan to siege the Capitol like that would have been pretty easily preventable if the police saw it coming. And I think that the policing tactics that were set up seemed very much based on the previous 2 million MAGA marches. So it seems like history, I don't know if I'd say they've forgotten, but history has not spent as much time emphasizing the fact that January 6th was the third of 3 million MAGA marches. And so the first one occurred on November 14th, and the second on December 12th. And in both of those situations, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of Trump supporters that showed up in D.C. With violence that, relative to the scale of people that was there, was relatively limited. And the violence was, I believe, exclusively civilian versus civilian, meaning Trump supporters fighting people who they perceived as antagonistic to them. So on the first one in November, some Trump supporters, particularly Proud Boys, continued to march around at night. There was a stabbing incident. People were fighting. There was some vandalism to businesses that had Black Lives Matter, signs and boards up on their properties. And on December 12th, there was an incident that left 4 people stabbed, as well as sort of more notoriously, they ripped a Black Lives Matter banner off of a church and set it on fire, which has now led to criminal charges for the president of the Proud Boys, Enrique Tarrio, as well as a civil lawsuit against him. Following all of that, I think that the police seemed probably prepared for a very large crowd, but not necessarily an antagonistic one, at least toward law enforcement, and more so seemed to be posturing to prevent violence between the left and the right, which I think is what they thought was going to happen. So what was fascinating about it was it wasn't like there was a shortage per se of personnel. The National Guard had actually been activated 2 days earlier, but they were activated and set up unarmed. And the idea was that the National Guard would basically deal with, traffic, crowds, and so forth to free up police to do sort of the actual functions of policing, right? If you don't have the cops having to deal with traffic, you can have more cops, arresting bad guys, right? If stuff happens. But they really didn't seem to be prepared for a crowd that was going to try to compromise the physical integrity of the Capitol itself, right? They had barriers set up, but not like large fencing, right? So this would be basically barriers set up that would block a crowd that is interested in being at the Capitol, but not interested in fighting the police to get there. So, I arrived very shortly after the first initial breach of that outer fencing, and from reviewing footage afterwards, it looks like it was toppled fairly effortlessly. There was just way too many people as compared to the police. One thing that I will say about that whole situation overall, having filmed it, on both fronts, the West Front and the East Front, and then returning to the West Front as they pushed everybody out, I have heard a lot of people use rhetoric about like the police let them in. I've heard this both from the left claiming that the police like essentially didn't put in as much work to prevent it from happening. And I've heard it from the right as casting blame for the whole situation happening. Like, oh, the police practically let them in, so they didn't have to force their way in. And I would disagree with that point, whether made by the left or the right. And the way that I would explain it is I think that they were way underprepared in advance. Like, I think that they clearly did not see the threat coming and did not prepare for it the way that any law enforcement body would think that they should. But with that being said, I did not see individual officers, for the most part, like basically be derelict in duty, right? I saw a couple of times where some police officers were sort of socializing with people, which probably does not look good for them. But the only time that I actually witnessed a retreat was on the Western Front. So there's the scaffolding being set up for the January 20th inauguration. That would be 2 weeks later. And as police were climbing up, as protesters were climbing up the stairs there, they were firing sting balls down at those people. And finally, after one point of maybe like a half hour of fighting like that, I saw the police basically just turn around and run away. And at the time, my feeling was like, that's weird. That's like a retreat. What I later learned because of reporting from New York Times's investigative team, actually, is that at a certain moment, the line was breached. And it was basically understood people are going to make it to the Capitol building. And so at that moment, they said, we're getting flanked. And so all units pull back. We're protecting the physical Capitol building now. There's no point left in trying to protect the ground. So the one moment I saw that I felt was like an instrumental, turning of the tides, like that felt like a surrender on the police's part at the time, I later realized was essentially like, actually warranted. Like the police would have been flanked moments later anyway. And so I've seen a lot of people use images of that moment essentially happened at every spot around the Capitol, right? Mm-hmm. And so I've seen a lot of images of police basically like running away from people that people have used to try to claim that the police didn't try. But what I witnessed really was moments of I think desperation, right? So like at the northeast entrance, there's like a smaller door. that that the police actually succeeded in preventing people from breaching. But what I first saw was police were trying to use flexi cuffs, like handcuff zip ties,
Right.
to force the door shut. And when that failed to work, they opened the door slightly and fired a fire extinguisher out at the crowd. And so that doesn't spell a lack of effort to me, right? That's a pretty
Right.
extreme thing to do, but it's not super effective, right? It's not like riot cops aren't like, here's your fire extinguisher, here's your fire extinguisher, right? That's not a riot control weapon, right? That's an improvised weapon.
Right.
And so my opinion of that moment, what it really illustrated for me, was that the police were vastly underprepared, which is in itself an intelligence failure, and a decision failure in advance of the event. But the police on site, I think, for the most part, were doing what they can with the low numbers and lack of equipment that they had.
Okay. All right. Did you ever feel in danger?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the crossfire a lot as it related to pepper spray in particular, because both police and Trump supporters were using mace toward each other. So I had one moment that I actually used as the thumbnail of my main YouTube video of this, where a Trump supporter is basically, the police are pushing forward, they're using flash grenades, they're using mace, and a Trump supporter like turns away and shoots bear mace like behind him at the cops. But the wind basically just carries the mace back to the people in his direction. So he ends up macing Trump supporters and himself. And actually, by the time I got home, right, I live with a few other people. When I got home, they turned on the air. This is January, right? But they turned on the air conditioning in the living room because when I entered the house, they were tasting like pepper spray in the air. Like I was so drenched in it that it was like hurting their eyes to be in the room with me. And actually, when the most painful point of the day, ironically, was actually when I showered. Some of the pepper gel kind of like sticks in your skin. So I was trying to get all that irritant out, and it actually like freed some of it up, which went like into my eyes, like in the shower. So I'm like expecting to finally be relieved, and I'm like, this is like worse. But of course, I would say some respiratory issues over the next couple of days just from gulping so much tear gas and so forth. But overall, I remained uninjured after the fact.
Excellent stories. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet.
Where can people go to donate to help you keep doing what you're doing?
Sure, I appreciate you asking that, because I do run largely on the support of the community. So my name is Ford Fischer. So you can find me on Twitter at Ford Fischer, and on Facebook and YouTube, the channel is NEWS2SHARE, which is news the number 2 share. My Patreon is patreon.com/Ford Fischer, and the account name on that is NEWS2SHARE. And as well, people can always contact me, and I'm happy to share like PayPal and Venmo information if people would prefer to donate in kind of a one-off way.
And it's FISCHER.
That's correct. Yep.
To make sure the viewers know that. All right. Well, thank you so very much. And there's the Patreon right there. Awesome. Okay. Thank you again, man.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. We'll do this again. I hope somewhere down the road. All right. Take care of yourself. Yep. This has been the American Dufus Show. Don't be a doofus.